Welcome to Getting Started with Adobe After Effects Creative Cloud 2019. My name is Lee Lawhon and I'm a video editor and animator. I've produced and directed content for screens both large and small. Though I started my career as a graphic designer, I quickly moved into motion graphics and 3D modeling, and have been in the industry for 10 years. Let's take a look at the course overview. With this course, we'll start with an overview in Section 1. In Section 2, we'll learn about the interface and common terms. In Section 3, we'll take a look at working with shapes and rotoscoping. Section 4, text and 3D effects. In Section 5, we'll add some animations. Section 6, we'll add some more effects and wrap things up. And finally, in Section 7, we'll learn how to render our projects. There are not really any prerequisites for this course. However, it would help if you had a basic understanding of video editing and some familiarity with other Adobe products such as Photoshop. The goals of this course are to understand the 12 principles of animation, add rotoscoping and effects to footage, work with Cinema 4D Light, animate images with the Puppet tool, and learn to render your work. I'm excited to share this course with you, so let's get started. In this section, we'll learn why we choose After Effects for a project, as well as some of the basics of animation. We'll learn what is Adobe After Effects, how it's different from other Adobe products, and then we'll look at the 12 basic principles of animation, something you'll use over and over again in the After Effects program. So what is Adobe After Effects? After Effects is a motion graphics, visual effects, and compositing software. In it, you can put 2D footage layers in 3D space, create 2D and 3D animations, merge two video clips to make a composited clip, add realistic effects, and much more. How's it different than other Adobe products? Well, here are the main programs you would use in the production of a video. Both Photoshop and Illustrator are asset creation programs. Though they do some animation, they're mainly used for still images. The difference between Photoshop and Illustrator is that Photoshop mainly works with pixel-based images, something you see quite clearly when you zoom in on a photograph taken by a camera. Illustrator mainly deals with vector-based graphics, something you'll become very familiar with in this tutorial. After Effects is where you do your special effects work and is best suited for small amounts of footage. On the other hand, Premiere is where you bring together large amounts of footage for editing. And finally, Adobe Media Encoder is where you can compress and convert your files. In the next video, we'll take a look at the 12 principles of animation. In this video, we'll take a look at the 12 principles of animation, which form the foundation of both animation and motion graphics. The 12 principles of animation were introduced by Frank Thomas and Ollie Johnston in the 1980s, and can be found in more detail in the book The Illusion of Life. But I'm going to illustrate them using an After Effects project I created for you to explore. As I go through the different principles, I'd like for you to follow along in the project. In the files, each composition is named for its principle. If you don't know what a composition is yet, don't worry. We'll be looking at them in the next section. A few things you might want to do are double-clicking a composition name to see inside of it. Those are the ones with the brown squares next to them. Clicking on the red ball to see a motion path, or toggling open the layer with the arrow to the left of the composition name to see the keyframes. The first principle is straight-ahead action and pose-to-pose. These are two different ways to animate an object, and we'll be using both techniques in this tutorial. The layer on top, labeled Red 2, is an example of pose-to-pose, where straight-ahead action is frame by frame and illustrated by the rest of the layers. This is the result of the two techniques. As you can see, they look similar. However, each technique has its own use, which we'll see later on. Easing in and out is our second principle and focuses on the fact that objects don't just start and stop. They tend to start slowly, then they speed up, and then they slow down when coming to a stop. Here I'm using ease in and out to give the red ball a bit of a spring action. The third principle is anticipation. An example of anticipation is the action you take before you kick or throw a ball, like swinging your leg or pulling your arm back. Here you see the red ball gets a bit of a running start by rolling back, and then it springs into the air. Squash and stretch is our fourth principle. You can see as the red ball goes into the air, it stretches a bit, and when it hits the ground, it squashes. The harder it hits the ground, the harder the squash. Squash and stretch is an easy way to turn any animation from something mechanical into something supple. In the fifth principle, arcs, you can easily see the effects of gravity. Because of gravity, objects can't freely travel in perfectly straight lines. They travel in arcs. As you see here, the red ball arcs as it comes in and arcs on the bounce on the way out. The sixth principle is follow through and overlapping action. Here I've added a blue ball that travels along with the red. If it moved at the same speed and perfectly connected to the red ball, it wouldn't be nearly as convincingly attached as it is here. The seventh principle is secondary action. Secondary action is a great way to add micro movements and expressions to your animations. Here I'm emphasizing the hit with an eye that clamps shut. Timing, the eighth principle, refers to the number of drawings or frames for a given action. As the red ball comes to a stop, the action slows down and bounces at the rate appropriate for a red ball. Animate it too slow and the red ball would look more like a boulder. Animate it too fast and it might resemble a balloon. The ninth principle is exaggeration, which, if done well, can add comedy or drama to your animation. Here the red ball encounters a yellow ball and is surprised. The 10th principle is solid drawing. You'll see here that even 2D characters can show 3D space. By using scale, positioning, overlap, and roundness to indicate volume, you can quickly give your animations the sense of space. Here I've added some new shapes for fins and I've added some more characters in the background. Staging is the 11th principle and allows you to frame a scene. Here I start with a close-up of the previous scene and pull back to reveal the larger environment. Finally, the 12th principle is appeal. It's a subjective principle, but you can see here that I've added more interesting shapes to my characters, put them in an environment, added some effects, more secondary movements, and adjusted the color. In this video, we've learned about the 12 principles of animation. Keep them in mind when you're working on your After Effects projects and try and get as many of them into your work as possible. These principles can quickly take amateur animations or motion graphics to a professional level. In our next section, we'll be building the background to our project, learning common terms, and looking at the interface more closely. In this section, we'll be building the background to our promotional video. We'll become familiar with the interface and learn some common terms along the way. We'll learn how to import clips, how to work with compositions and the current time indicator. We'll look at layers and layer options. We'll add some effects, and we'll look at the responsive design feature in Keyframes. Let's start our project by importing and managing clips. So for this exercise, we'll need some footage. I'm going to use pixabay.com, which has some for free. I'll come over to the Video tab and do a search for fish. I'll scroll about halfway down until I see the stingray footage that I like. Click on it. Now, note with Pixabay, you can use this footage. However, I can't distribute it, which is why I'm asking you to download it. So to download it, choose Free Download, and we'll use the 1920 by 1080 footage. We'll move that to our Assets folder, and then we'll go back to After Effects to import it. In After Effects, let's look at the first panel here on the left-hand side. This is our Projects panel and is where we can manage and import our clips. Let's first start by creating a folder by clicking on the icon in the lower left, and we'll call this Footage. With that selected, I'm going to choose File, Import File, and in my Assets folder, I'll choose the Raise video we just downloaded. In the next video, We'll turn this into a composition and look at the current time indicator. In this video, we'll look at compositions and the current time indicator. Create a composition. I'm going to click this icon in the lower left-hand side. And we're going to call this composition main. We'll leave the presets as is because we want the HDTV 1080 29.97 option. The 1080 refers to the width and height, which is standard, and the 29.97 is the frame rate, also standard. Hit OK. A composition is essentially an artboard. It has dimension, it has its own timeline, and it's also a grouping mechanism for your assets. You'll see this as we add elements. You can see the composition here in the center panel, which is where we'll preview all of our assets. Now that we have our composition, we can take a look at the Layers and Timeline panel. Over here on the left is the Layers panel. We'll go in depth on that shortly. To the right is the timeline with the current time indicator, or CTI. This will allow you to choose specific frames on the timeline. You can use the scrub, or you can use your page up key or page down key to move up and down the timeline one frame at a time. If you want to jump 10 frames, hold your shift key and use page up and page down to jump 10 frames at a time. At the bottom of the composition window, we can zoom in and zoom out using this selector, or we can choose to fit the composition in the window. Additionally, you can use Command or Control on the PC with plus or minus to zoom in and zoom out. At the top of the timeline, you'll see the Time Navigator. The Time Navigator allows you to zoom in on frames and move across them. Below that is the Work area, and we'll use this a little later to trim our footage. In the next video, we'll dig a look deeper into the Layers and Layer Options panel. In this video, we'll look at layers and layer options. Let's create a solid layer in our composition and call it Bubbles. To do that, make sure your main composition is selected and the tab is active down here in the Layers panel. We'll choose Layer, New, and we're going to create a solid layer. Solid layers are great for adding effects and creating solid color fields. We'll call it Bubbles. And because we want it to cover our entire composition, we'll leave the setting at 1920 by 1080. Notice you can change the color of the layer down here, but it's not going to matter for this example because we're going to add an effect which will override that. Before we move forward, I want to put my bubbles into another composition and call it Background. So if you ever create assets and forget to put them in a composition, you can easily do so by right-clicking and choosing Pre-compose. This creates a composition for you. Let's name it Background and leave all attributes in main. We'll double-click on our composition to get inside of it and activate the Bubbles layer by selecting it. One thing you can do with layers is you can crop them. So by selecting the red bar here, you'll notice I can crop in on the layer. Additionally, if I click in the middle of the layer, I can move it. This is how you can crop layers and crop video content. We'll see a little bit more of that later. Next, let's look at the panels on the right. These panels are configurable, and you'll notice if you drag on the name, you can move them to different locations. If you don't see a panel that you're looking for, say you click on this menu and close the panel, you can always come to the Window menu and choose it again. If for any reason your panel or workspace gets messed up like mine is, you can also always go to the Window menu, choose Workspace, and reset, and you'll see here I'm using this standard workspace. In the next video, we'll add effects to our layer. In this video, we'll add effects to our project. We'll create a solid layer in our composition. If you accidentally added your composition to the footage folder like I did, you can simply select it and drag it outside of the folder. With the main composition selected, I'm going to choose Layer, New, and we're going to create a solid layer. We'll call this Bubbles, and We want this to cover the entire background, so we'll use 1920 by 1080 again. Note, you can change the color of your solid layer. In addition to being color fields, solid layers are great for adding effects. And when you add an effect, it'll override the color. You'll see what I mean in just a moment. I want to move this bubbles layer to a composition. If you ever add an asset and forget to put it into a composition, all you have to do is right-click on the layer and choose Pre-Compose, and we'll give it a name of Background. And by clicking OK, it'll move that into a composition. Now we have a background composition nested inside of our main composition. We'll double-click on the background composition so that we can see our layer again. One thing you can do with both layers and compositions is you can shorten them. To do that, bring your cursor to the edge of the layer and move it to the inside. This crops the layer. We'll do this with both compositions and video layers. Additionally, if you want to move the layer, you can click in the middle of the red bar and slide it around. But let's add an effect to this layer. To the right-hand side, we have the Effects and Presets panel. There's a lot of these, so rather than digging through all the folders here, I'm going to do a search. The first effect we want to apply is called CC Particle World. We can either drag the effect directly into the preview window, or we can drag it in the layer panel. Now, instead of a solid layer, we have a particle producer that's producing. With this layer selected, you should see the Effects Controls panel next to your Projects panel. Inside of that, we'll open up the Particle tab, and we'll change the particle type from line to bubble. We'll also change the color. I'll make the birth color a light blue, and I'll make the death color a dark blue. While we're here, the bubbles are a little bit large, so let's change the birth size to a smaller number and the depth size to a smaller number. Now our bubbles are coming from the center of the screen and they're going down. We'll look at the Physics tab to change that. The first thing we want to do is change the gravity. Instead of a positive number which would go down, we'll change it to a negative number which will float up. To change the position of the producer, we'll close the Physics tab and open up the producer. Let's move our Y position all the way down to the bottom of the screen. And to spread the bubbles out, we'll change the X radius, Y radius, and Z radius. Now we have bubbles that spread out across our composition and float up. Now that we have our bubbles, let's create a gradient background to go behind them. Once again, I'll choose Layer, New, Solid. Now notice there's a lot of other layer types here. We'll see a few more of these a little later on. This solid layer I want to call Deep Sea. We'll leave the presets and the color. And the second effect I want to add is called a gradient ramp. I'll drag it here to the preview window. Now notice this is covering up our bubbles. To move the deep sea layer under our bubbles, just simply click on it and drag it below. We'll change the start color to a dark blue by clicking on the swatch. I'm going to use 004887 here. And we'll change the end color to a light blue, and I'll use BFE2FB. Finally, you may want to duplicate your bubble layer to add some dimension, and either choose Edit, Duplicate, or use the Command or Control D shortcut. For the bottom bubble, let's adjust the producer by changing the X position to slightly offset it. We'll select the bottom bubbles layer, and we'll change the producer by opening up the Producer tab and slightly offsetting the position X and position Y. We'll add a blur effect to give it some depth. If you scroll down, I'm going to use the Fast Box Blur and drag it onto the layer. I'll up the blur radius, and now our bubbles have a bit of a shadow behind them. In the next video, we're going to look at keyframes and the responsive design feature. In this video, we'll go back to our footage and work with some keyframes and the responsive design feature. Back in our main composition, I'm going to create a composition from our raise footage. To do that, you can simply drag the raise footage on top of the composition button. Now, we don't need all of this footage. We only want the part where the stingray comes in and where he leaves. So to trim this, I'm going to show you another technique. Right where the stingray comes on, you can use the work area to trim your composition. So I'm going to slide the work area just to meet the CTI, and I'll find the end position we want, which is right about here at 15 seconds and 22 frames. I'll slide the work area to meet the CTI there as well. You can set composition, trim comp to work area. And now we have composition that is just of our stingray moving in and out of the frame. Let's now add some keyframes to our footage. Keyframes are ways of animating assets. If I toggle open the arrow to the left of the footage name, you'll see I have this transform tab. To start any animation, all you have to do is click on the stopwatch to the left of the name of the transformation you want to animate. You'll notice that adds a keyframe where your current time indicator was, and you can tell that your current time indicator is on the keyframe by this keyframe indicator. Let's add a second keyframe, 20 frames, into the footage. So to get 20 frames, I'm going to hold my Shift key and hit page down twice. To add another keyframe, I could either change the opacity here or simply click on the keyframe indicator. Let's go back to our first keyframe with Shift page up, and now we want to drop the opacity to 0. Now scrubbing through your footage, you'll see that the footage fades on over 20 frames. Let's do the same thing for the end. I'll create a keyframe, I'll Shift page up twice, add a second keyframe, go back to the first, and drop the opacity to 0. Now our footage fades in and it fades out. If you ever need to move a keyframe, all you have to do is simply click on them and drag them. I'm going to hit Command or Control Z to undo that. Or if you want to move multiple keyframes, you can either shift click on them or marquee drag over them and move them. We're going to look at the new responsive design feature. So to demo this, I'd like for you to drag out a marker, which is to the right of the work area, and we'll put one here. Double click on it, and we'll make the duration 20 frames. We'll do the same here at the end, double click, and make it 20 frames. Coming back to our main composition, I want to drag our raise composition into it, so drag it above the background. And now you can see the markers we've just added. Use the zoom slider at the very bottom of the timeline to zoom in and go to the very beginning of our composition. Now, sometimes you might want to slow or speed up footage. This is pretty easy to do, but I'll show you there's a problem. To stretch footage or slow it down, you want to right-click on the headers here and choose Columns, Stretch. And you'll see that with the stretch, I can increase or decrease footage percentage. By increasing it, I'm slowing down the footage. But notice, I no longer have the 20 frames I wanted for opacity animation. To fix that, we're going to use the new responsive design feature. So I'll set my stretch back to 100, and I'll go back into my raise composition. If you double-click on the markers we created, you'll see at the bottom the responsive design time protected region. I'll turn that on for both markers. And now when we go back to our main composition, you'll see if I stretch, You'll see now if we go back to our main composition and replace our raised footage, those markers turn to a blue highlighted section. And when I stretch, I keep my 20 frames of opacity animation. In this section, we've imported clips, worked with the interface, and added some effects. In the next section, we'll take a look at working with shapes and rotoscoping.